The incident primarily took place in the 1930s with Tapas' grandfather, who was a young man at the time. He had just been newly married and lived in the village with his parents and wife. He worked at a vegetable wholesale market, and whatever he earned from there was enough to sustain their family. Every morning he would head to the market, work all day, and return home in the evening. It was indeed a hard and challenging life. Once, while working in the fields, Tapas's great-grandfather, his grandfather's father, caught a fever after being drenched in the rain. The fever worsened and seemed to turn into pneumonia. It is worth noting that this happened in the month of Baisakh, April-May, a time known for storms and rains. Tapas's grandfather immediately called the local village doctor for treatment. The doctor treated his father with some preliminary remedies and herbal medicines to reduce the fever. Even after the treatment, his father's condition didn't improve. Every evening after returning from work, Tapas's grandfather would ask his mother about his father's health, only to hear that there was no improvement. His mother would tell him the fever kept returning and that the herbal medicines seemed ineffective. Seeing his father's worsening condition, he decided to visit the doctor again. One afternoon he went to the doctor's house, only to be told by the doctor's wife that the doctor was resting after lunch and would be available in the evening. Tapas's grandfather pleaded with her to wake the doctor, explaining his father's critical condition and his inability to return later due to work. His heartfelt requests moved the doctor's wife, and she agreed to wake the doctor. The doctor, upon hearing the situation, wrote down the name of a specific medicine and advised Tapas's grandfather to get it from the city since he did not have it in stock. The journey to the city was long and arduous. It was about 30 to 40 kilometers away, requiring travel on foot, by bullock cart, and finally, a boat. The next morning, Tapas's grandfather started his journey early. By the time he reached the city, it was already noon. After searching for a while, he found a pharmacy, bought the medicine, and began his return journey. However, heavy rain started pouring down while he was still at the city's outskirts. Taking shelter temporarily in the pharmacy, he eventually decided to brave the rain and head towards the river crossing. He managed to board a boat heading towards his village and reached the riverbank late at night. It was pitch dark with only the faint glow of fireflies and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the path. Finding no carts or transport available, he started walking home through muddy, deserted roads surrounded by large, eerie trees. At one point, the road split into two, and in the darkness he couldn't remember which path he had taken earlier. Suddenly, a thunderclap struck, and a cold, gusty wind began to blow, followed by a torrential downpour. He decided to take the left path, walking as fast as he could in the mud and rain. After walking for some time, he heard the sound of galloping hooves behind him. Turning around, he saw a faint light approaching in the distance. As it drew closer, he realized it was a carriage pulled by two black horses. What was terrifying, however, was the sight of the driver, a headless figure dressed in English-style clothing, holding the reins. The headless rider whipped the horses, speeding them toward Tapas's grandfather. Frozen in fear, he screamed, but couldn't make a sound. He turned and ran as fast as he could, slipping and stumbling through the mud. Behind him, he could hear the thundering hooves and the terrifying sound of the rider closing in. The rest of the story is a tale of fear, courage, and the unexplained, a haunting memory that Tapas's grandfather carried with him throughout his life. It started with an old key, a small, rusty artifact that seemed unremarkable at first glance. It lay in the attic of my grandmother's house, hidden under layers of dust and forgotten belongings. When I found it, it was tucked inside a cracked porcelain jewelry box, alongside faded photographs of strangers whose eyes seemed to follow me as I examined them. I was drawn to the key, its jagged teeth worn with age. It felt heavier than it should have been, as though it carried something far more significant than its size suggested. My grandmother's house was a sprawling Victorian relic, filled with narrow hallways, creaking floorboards, and countless rooms whose purposes had faded with time. I'd been sent there to sort through her belongings after her sudden passing. She'd always been a private woman, her life cloaked in secrecy, and I'd never been particularly close to her. Still, it was my duty, and I approached it with equal parts curiosity and dread. The key felt warm in my palm as I wandered the house, trying it in various locks. None of them yielded. Hours passed and frustration mounted. I'd almost given up when I noticed a door I'd somehow overlooked. It was at the end of a long corridor, shrouded in shadows that seemed unnaturally thick. The door was unremarkable, painted the same faded white as the rest of the house. But the doorknob was different, a tarnished brass handle engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. My heart raced as I approached the door. The key fit perfectly, sliding into the lock with a satisfying click. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a staircase that spiraled down into darkness. A draft of cool, damp air greeted me, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and it pulled me forward, one cautious step at a time. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, descending far deeper than the house's foundation should have allowed. My footsteps echoed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive blackness that surrounded me. The light from my phone barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, flickering shadows on the damp stone walls. The further I went, the colder it became, until my breath fogged in front of me, and my fingers grew numb. At last I reached the bottom. The space opened into a cavernous room, the walls lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of countless objects. Books bound in cracked leather, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and strange artifacts that defied description. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay an open book. Its pages were filled with intricate symbols and diagrams, written in a language I didn't recognize. A sense of unease settled over me as I approached the table. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy that made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch the book, but a whisper stopped me. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but whose tone carried an undeniable warning. I spun around, the light from my phone darting across the room. There was nothing there, just shadows and silence. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I backed away, my instincts finally overriding my curiosity. As I turned to leave, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging me into total darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone, the light shaking in my trembling hand. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they became an unbearable cacophony. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. Faces emerged from the darkness, their eyes hollow and their mouths stretched into silent screams. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled up the stairs. The air grew thicker with every step, pressing against me like an invisible weight. The whispers turned into screams, a chorus of agony that reverberated through my skull. When I finally reached the top, the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. Desperation took over as I pounded on the wall, screaming for help. The room below seemed to pulse with life, the shadows growing larger and more distinct. One of them began to rise, a towering figure with eyes like burning coals. It pointed at me and the whispers fell silent. "You shouldn't have come," a voice boomed, deep and resonant, echoing in my chest. It wasn't angry, but filled with a terrible sadness, as though I'd awakened something that had been meant to remain undisturbed. The figure reached out, its hand impossibly long and clawed. It didn't touch me, but I felt it all the same, a cold, searing pain that shot through my body. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt. I fell to the ground, darkness closing in around me. When I woke, I was back in the attic, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The door to the staircase was gone, as though it had never existed, but the whispers remained, faint and distant, always just at the edge of hearing. The house felt different, its shadows deeper and more oppressive. I didn't stay long after that, abandoning the task I'd been sent to do. I've never returned to my grandmother's house. The key remains locked away in a box, hidden in the darkest corner of my closet. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of it and feel that familiar weight in my chest. And at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear the whispers, reminding me of the door that should never have been opened. If you would like to share with us a true story that happened to you or that you know of, please write down or voice record the story and send it to our email address. Our email address is ghostsredeye@gmail.com. Also, it's given in the video's description box. Now we move on to the next incident. The night was darker than it had any right to be. The clouds had swallowed the moon, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Miles from the nearest town, the cabin stood alone, a solitary structure surrounded by towering pines and a suffocating silence. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for 5 friends to disconnect from their devices and reconnect with each other. But something felt off the moment they arrived. Emma was the first to voice it. "It's too quiet here," she whispered as they unpacked their bags. "I mean, really quiet. Like no birds, no bugs. Nothing." "That's the point," Jake replied, his voice tinged with impatience. "No distractions. Just us and nature." Still, the unease lingered. The cabin itself was old, its wooden walls warped and weathered. The air inside smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. A deer head mounted above the fireplace stared down at them with glassy eyes, its antlers casting twisted shadows on the walls. No one commented on it, but everyone felt its gaze. By the time they settled in, the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into an inky blackness. They lit a fire in the hearth and gathered around, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows. It was then that Sarah suggested they tell scary stories, a tradition among their group. "I'll start," she said, leaning forward. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Have you ever heard of the Whisperer?" The others shook their heads. "It's an old legend," Sarah continued. "Supposedly, it started in this area. People say there's a creature in these woods that can mimic voices. It'll call out to you, sounding like someone you know, someone you trust. But if you follow the voice, you'll never come back." "Oh, come on," Jake scoffed. "That's just a campfire story," Sarah shrugged. "Maybe, but there's a reason locals don't come out here. They say the Whisperer doesn't just mimic voices. It knows things about you, secrets you've never told anyone." The group fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Then Ethan, always the skeptic, broke the tension with a nervous laugh. "Well, I'm not planning to wander off, so I think I'm safe." Still, the atmosphere had changed. The fire burned lower, the shadows growing darker. They decided to call it a night, each retreating to their rooms. But sleep didn't come easily. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The bed creaked with every slight movement, and the wind outside seemed to carry faint whispers. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. In the next room, Sarah tossed and turned. She had told the story to scare her friends, but now she regretted it. The legend of the Whisperer had been something she'd read online, a bit of folklore she thought would add some fun to their trip. But now, in the oppressive darkness, it felt too real. A sudden noise jolted her upright. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. She strained her ears, holding her breath. There it was again, closer this time. She reached for her phone, the faint glow of the screen illuminating her trembling hands. No signal, "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. She crept to the door and opened it a crack, peering into the hallway. It was empty, but the air felt heavier, as if the darkness itself was alive. She closed the door quickly, her heart pounding. In his room, Jake was having a similar experience. He had heard someone calling his name, faint and distant. At first, he thought it was one of the others, but the voice was off. It sounded like his mother, but distorted, as if coming through a bad connection. "Jake," it called again, clearer this time. "Help me." Against his better judgment, he got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the voice persisted, coming from the direction of the living room. He hesitated, every instinct telling him to go back to bed, but the voice, it sounded so real. "Mom?" he called out, his voice shaking. No response, just the crackling of the dying fire. Jake took a step forward, then another. The floorboards groaned under his weight, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. As he reached the living room, he saw a figure standing by the fireplace. It was his mother, or at least it looked like her. She was turned away from him, her shoulders trembling as if she were crying. "Mom?" he said again, stepping closer. The figure turned slowly, and Jake's blood ran cold. It was his mother's face, but wrong. Her eyes were too large, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. She opened her mouth to speak, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was his own. "Jake," it said, the grin widening. "Come closer." He stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling hard. When he looked up, the figure was gone. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to his room, slamming the door and locking it. His heart was racing, his mind struggling to make sense of what he'd seen. Meanwhile, Emma was experiencing her own nightmare. She had heard a knock at her window, soft at first, but growing more insistent. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just a branch in the wind. But then she heard a voice. "Emma, let me in." It was Sarah's voice, clear and desperate. "Please, Emma, I'm scared." Emma froze. Sarah's room was on the other side of the cabin. There was no way she could be outside the window. Summoning her courage, Emma approached the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Just darkness. She let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. The voice came again, closer this time. "Emma, open the window." She backed away, her hands trembling. "Go away," she shouted. The voice stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a pillow to her chest, and waited for dawn. Morning brought no comfort. The group gathered in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke at first, the tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Did anyone else hear things last night?" One by one, they shared their experiences. The voices, the footsteps, the figure by the fireplace. It was Sarah who finally said what they were all thinking. The whisperer. "This is ridiculous," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be a logical explanation." "Like what?" Sarah shot back. "We all heard it. We all saw something. Are you really going to tell me it's a coincidence?" They argued for hours, but no one had any answers. By midday, they decided to leave. Whatever was happening, none of them wanted to stay another night. But when they tried to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. The gas tank was empty, despite having been full when they arrived. "That's impossible," Ethan said, his voice rising in panic. "We haven't driven anywhere." "Maybe it's a leak," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They were trapped. With no cell service and no way to leave, their only option was to wait for help. But as the day wore on, the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of their eyes, and the whispers returned, faint but persistent. By nightfall, they were too scared to sleep. They huddled together in the living room, the fire their only source of light. Hours passed in tense silence, each of them straining to hear any sound out of place. Then, just as the fire began to die, the knocking started. It came from the front door, slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. "Who is it?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. No answer, just another knock. "Don't open it," Sarah whispered. "No matter what." The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. Then came the voices. They called out to each of them, familiar and pleading. Jake heard his mother. Emma heard Sarah. Ethan heard his younger brother, who had died years ago. "It's not real," Sarah said, though tears streamed down her face. "Don't listen to it." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more desperate. The knocking turned to pounding, the door shaking on its hinges. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one moved, no one spoke. Then came a new sound, the creak of floorboards from inside the cabin. They weren't alone. The fire flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Emma screamed, and the group scrambled to relight it. When the flames returned, they saw that one of them was missing. "Ethan! Ethan!" Sarah shouted, but there was no response. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the cabin. They called their names, mocking and cruel. "We have to find him," Jake said, though his face was pale with fear. They searched the cabin, but Ethan was nowhere to be found. Then they noticed something horrifying. The front door was open, the lock broken. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and uninviting. "He wouldn't have gone out there," Emma said, her voice shaking. But deep down, they all knew he had. The Whisperer had called to him, and he had answered. They never saw Ethan again. By morning, the whispers had stopped, and the car started, as if nothing had been wrong. They drove away in silence, each of them haunted by the events of that night. To this day, none of them speak of what happened in the cabin. But sometimes, late at night, they hear whispers in the dark calling their names. Now we move on to the next incident. The road stretched long and empty, cutting through an ancient forest that had stood for centuries. The trees here were tall and twisted, their gnarled roots creeping onto the cracked asphalt. The moon, pale and distant, barely pierced through the thick canopy, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the road. Deep within this forest, at the very heart of the darkness, stood an ancient banyan tree, its roots thick as serpents, its branches sprawling like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The locals called it the Whispering Tree. No one dared to go near it after sunset. No one ever spoke of why. On this particular night, Daniel was driving alone, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The static of the radio filled the silence, the frequency slipping in and out of clarity. He had heard the warnings about this road, but had shrugged them off as mere superstition. After all, it was just a tree. Just a legend, or so he thought. As he approached the tree, a sudden chill crept up his spine. The air in the car grew thick, suffocating. The headlights flickered. The static on the radio shifted, and for a brief moment he could swear he heard whispering, faint, distant voices murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. Daniel swallowed hard, shaking his head, just his mind playing tricks. Just fatigue. Then he saw them. 7 figures standing beneath the tree, dressed in flowing white garments that fluttered despite the still air. Their faces were obscured by long, dark hair, their bodies unnaturally still. They faced the road, standing in perfect alignment, as if they had been waiting for him. His breath hitched. He pressed harder on the accelerator, determined to speed past, but the car refused to move any faster. The road beneath him felt endless, stretching impossibly far. One of the figures moved, a slow, deliberate step forward. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his pulse hammering in his ears. Another figure followed, then another. The 7 women began to drift towards his car, their movements fluid, unnatural. like they were gliding rather than walking. The radio screeched, a piercing wail that sent a shock through his spine. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, echoing inside his skull. He clenched his teeth, trying to drown them out, but they slithered into his mind like tendrils of smoke. Stop! Get out! Join us! The words were not spoken aloud. They were inside him, vibrating through his bones. A cold breath kissed the back of his neck. Daniel snapped his head around. A face, pale, hollow eyes, a mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, stared at him from the back seat. His scream never made it past his lips. The car spun out of control, skidding off the road and slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. The windshield spider-webbed, glass raining down like tiny shards of ice. Darkness swallowed him whole. Silence. When Daniel opened his eyes, the world was wrong. He was outside his car, standing beneath the whispering tree. The figures surrounded him, their long hair parting just enough to reveal grins that were too wide, eyes that were too empty. One by one they stepped closer, their whispers wrapping around him like chains. Then they began to laugh. It started soft, almost melodic, but soon grew into something twisted, something unnatural. Daniel tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. His body refused to obey. The figures reached for him, and then the forest swallowed him whole. Days later, when the police found the wrecked car, the driver's seat was empty. No sign of Daniel. Only the deep, claw-like marks scratched into the inside of the windshield, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. And beneath the whispering tree, where the roots curled like skeletal hands, there was an eighth figure standing among the others, its hair long, its face hidden, its presence a silent echo of those who had come before. If you would like to share with us a true story that happened to you or that you know of, please write down or voice record the story and send it to our email address. Our email address is ghostsredeye@gmail.com. Also, it's given in the video's description box.